My biggest concern is that analysts and reporting and government agencies look at the active clubs and think that this is about sports, which is somewhat concerning. Racists and neo-Nazis doing sports together like boxing and MMA. But this is not really the story. They are preparing for targeted violence undercover, and that this is not being appreciated and understood by especially law enforcement. This is the biggest threat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Hate Comes to Main Street. My guest today is Alexander Ritzmann. He is a senior advisor with the Counter Extremism Project. He leads the group's work in Europe analyzing violent far-right extremism and transnational terror networks. I began by asking him about a recent report by The Guardian about how members of neo-Nazi active clubs have been gathering in combat-style events at a secretive compound in Virginia. Some of those same characters have been involved in similar events in East Tennessee. Alexander, thank you for joining me. Let me start with that Guardian story because there are a lot of people who enjoy watching MMA types of fights. Some people like to participate in such fights. Why should viewers care about this story?
I think it's a great question because there's a lot of protection around free speech, for example, in the United States. So being a racist, for example, or even a right-wing extremist is not necessarily considered an issue, especially it's not illegal. And then you have some racists and right-wing extremists doing combat sports like mixed martial arts. And then it gets a little more interesting because what the ideology does, it is like a navigation system. It tells you who your enemies are and who to attack. And that's the difference between any citizen who enjoys some kind of combat sports and a violent extremist that enjoys doing combat sports, because usually they have a plan, they have targets that they see as their enemies, and they have some sort of scenario where they're going to apply that violence that they're practicing towards that target group. And this is the big difference between anyone who likes sports and extremists who prepare for violence through mixed martial arts.
Now, we're talking in general that this movement is called the Active Club movement. Um, can you explain what that is?
Absolutely. So the name in itself is like, this could be anything, the active club. So this is by purpose. It is supposed to kind of sound random and mainstream so that people who look at this not automatically associate the term active club with anything of concern. Now, the active club strategy is basically, you could frame it as a wolves in sheep's clothing, right? So you have violent neo-Nazis who ran into law enforcement in the past, have been arrested and went to prison for conspiracy to riot. And as a lesson from that experience, they come up with this idea of active clubs, basically wolves in sheep's clothing, by saying, okay, originally we are trying to build a neo-Nazi militia. But if we build a neo-Nazi militia in public, the FBI will look at us. They might even infiltrate our network. So how can we avoid that problem of being infiltrated by the FBI? We pretend that we're only about sports, that we're only a bunch of nationalists, racists who like to take hikes in the forest, sit around a fire and practice camaraderie and do some kind of combat sports. And this is really the essence. The essence of the active club strategy is to fool law enforcement into believing that this is just about sports, because they want to avoid the 5 o'clock in the morning SWAT team raids that they had experienced previously. And this is the smart and dangerous part of this strategy. This is not just a national sports club or nationalist sports club. In its essence, it's the strategy to build a neo-Nazi militia.
And they have compared themselves to the Minutemen of American history fame. I think you've called them militias hiding in plain sight. So that's what you're talking about there.
Absolutely. So this idea that this is a neo-Nazi militia is based on their own communications, right? So, and as any violent extremist organization that wants, on one hand, to recruit new members, but on the other hand, appear harmless, they communicate two things at the same time. On the one hand, they say, we are just about sports and, let's say, heritage. And on the other hand, they continuously and frequently reference themselves in the context of the 1920s in Europe. They reference themselves as in the context of the stormtroopers of the Nazi Party, the Hitler Youth, the SS, and recently, and I think this is to be, let's say, less controversial than referencing yourself with the Hitler Youth, they reference themselves with the so-called black shirts of fascist Italy. That was Mussolini's, the dictator of Italy in the 20s and 30s. That was like his personal paramilitary force. And it just like last week, they said that the black shirts need to rise again. And this week, they had a video pushed out on their Telegram channels that was showing the black shirts marching in Italy in the 1930s. So this is definitely their own propaganda, but it is more inward facing. It is more trying to convince other racist and right-wing extremists to join them. At the same time, they tell everyone else that they're just a harmless sports outfit.
And how would you describe the ideology? White supremacy, neo-Nazism, uh, white separatists? What is the ideology behind these groups?
They see themselves in the broader context of what they would say is white nationalism. They call themselves white nationalists 3.0. 1.0 would be the skinhead movement of the 80s and 90s, more like openly violent, like grim-looking individuals. Then there's the alt-right, they are saying that's 2.0. These are the keyboard warriors who spend most of their time online trying to be activists. And the Active Club, they say they are the white nationalist 3.0, meaning they take it into reality. This is about a network of men who practice for violence. They will say mostly in public that it will be self-defense, right? But they see themselves as a white supremacist movement. They see themselves in the context of the so-called Great Replacement, this theory that there is a worldwide conspiracy against white people, that the white race, that there's a genocide against white people, and that they are basically a militia in building that militia at the moment, and they're waiting for leadership. And this is why they reference the 1920s and 30s so often. Leadership like Adolf Hitler, like Mussolini, someone who takes the fight forward that they can then protect and fight for. So they then see themselves as having fights on the street and not just boxing fights, because some of them practice openly with AR-15 style semi-automatic rifles, for example. So this is how they frame themselves, as a white supremacy neo-Nazi militia. And neo-Nazi really is appropriate here because they frequently reference Nazi Germany and fascist Italy.
So if this is a militia hiding in plain sight, what is the battle they're preparing for?
They say we are preparing for the time when a white supremacist leader is worth and in need of protection. So that they go back into the 1920s when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were slowly rising in relevance. They had a militia, the so-called stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung of the party. And this was a paramilitary force. And they would fight other groups. They would protect the leadership of the Nazi Party, and they would assassinate political enemies. And they reference themselves in this context. Similarly, the black shirts in Italy, same functionality. And as I've mentioned, since 4 years, this network in its own propaganda is constantly reframing itself in this heritage, in this tradition.
Robert Rundo is the leader of the Active Club movement. Who is he and what does he want?
Robert Rundo was born and raised in Queens, New York, and in his own words was involved in gang violence as a young man, 15, 16, 17 years old. He was sentenced to juvenile incarceration for stabbing another gang member, or other kinds of brawls and violence. When you listen to the podcasts that he has put out over the years, there's really a glorification of violence. It's this idea that this would be self-defense is there in words, but at least, my impression is that the violence is being considered as something fun and something to look forward to. And he then moved to California, started a movement, a group called the Rise Above movement, and that group was openly calling for violence, was conspiring to riot, was involved in some brawls at demonstrations, pro-Trump rallies at the time, 2015, 16. And as a result, because law enforcement at the time went very harshly on him, the SWAT teams I mentioned at the SWAT raids that I mentioned at the beginning made a lasting impact. People were arrested and sentenced. And this is where the active club strategy then comes from, as a lesson learned, as an attempt to organize and build a shadow militia, a neo-Nazi militia, without raising the suspicion of law enforcement, and then in some point be ready to practice targeted violence at the day X scenario. This is referring to a point in time when it is worth basically dropping the cover, dropping the sheep's clothing, and actually showing who they are and who they want to be.
And Robert Rundo spent, I think, about 2 years in prison for attacking some anti-Trump demonstrators. And you have a recent report expressing concern about his activities now that he's been released. What are those concerns?
Yeah, so the Active Lab network is an open network. It doesn't have central leadership, but it was founded by members of this Rise Above movement in California, also some members of the Hammerskins, that's an older neo-Nazi group in the US and in Europe, was involved, and some other actors. And they came up with this active club strategy. Robert Rundo was the visible face. He got involved in violence, as you said. He got sentenced to prison. But before he actually spent time in prison this time, he was fleeing to Europe. He was hiding for several years in Europe, was traveling Europe, and was basically learning from extreme right-wing neo-Nazi groups in Europe on how to organize violent extreme right-wing groups. And this he brought back into the United States, and this led to the creation of the Active Club network at the time. They arrested him in Bulgaria, and he was in prison for some months. Actually, the total period of incarceration was 2 years. Then he was released from prison in last year in 2025. He was kind of quiet for a couple of months. This might have been related to requirements regarding his release from prison. And since then, he has put out a new, let's say, strategic communications, how the worldwide network, which exists in almost 30 countries with more than 100 clubs, how they should now move on from what they've been doing so far. And one of the key points he is highlighting was like less spectacle, more infrastructure. So they do these mixed martial arts tournaments, for example. They do these, like in Virginia, hooligan style brawls, 8 versus 8, a street fight competition and practice. So he says this is all great, but we need infrastructure. We need our own gyms. We need our own companies as well. We need a parallel economy where our active club members can work together, can make money together, and grow this further to what they want to be at the moment. So at the moment, this is, let's say, a decentralized, loose network, and they want to make this into a more fundamental and strong network. And this is some of the key points he is raising. So less spectacle, more structure, more business activity as well. He is asking the network to continue generating youth clubs. So they're trying to recruit 16-year-old high school age into this environment. There's already a broad network of youth clubs. And the latest update that happened was because there was a killing of a right-wing extremist in France, in Lyon, in February this year, by left-wing extremists. And as a consequence, he has called this event as a turning point. And he has again referenced the black shirts, the fascist militia from Italy, that they should rise again, not as cosplay, but as a vanguard, and that the time to just sit back and wait is over. So there's a lot happening currently in this field.
In fact, he had a recent blog post where he defended these fights, saying every victorious nationalist movement was forged by hardened men who'd already tasted real danger. And he said, these events are a tip off point for a fascist cultural revolution. It is the first step in building our own parallel system. So he's just blatantly voicing what you have said, correct?
Yeah. This is absolutely the case. And this is a little bit tricky because on one side, it's like a double face strategy. There's a smiling face towards the broader public. They want to recruit disgruntled, frustrated young white men into the movement, but they don't want to scare them away immediately with Nazi propaganda. There's actually concrete advice by the active club in the United States. So when you're trying to recruit people, don't talk about the Jews at the beginning, right? Just bring people in, let them work out together, and then we'll see if this is a match or not. So there's the smiling face that says we are just a bunch of nationalists. We are concerned about the white heritage, but everything else is just propaganda from the media. We are definitely not a neo-Nazi group. And then the other face of the same group is the more grim-looking face that is constantly referencing the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, until last week and the weeks before, saying, the time to wait is over. We need to practice more for violence, and the black shirts need to rise again. And this is tricky, I think, for a lot of policymakers, people in government jobs on a local level, law enforcement. So what is it? Is this just another combat sports club that has sometimes another combat sports club that has sometimes weird symbols and activities? Or is this really a neo-Nazi militia that is hiding in plain sight, pretending to be a sports club so that law enforcement says this is weird, but we have more important things to do? And the latter is the actual strategy in my understanding.
What I hear sometimes from people is, number one, you're exaggerating the threat. Number two, just ignore them. Don't give them any attention. What is your answer to that criticism?
There is definitely some criticism well placed regarding, let's say, inadvertently promoting active club ideology. Some people might not know about active clubs, but once there's a lot of reporting, they might get interested. And these might be exactly, let's say, young men with a tendency to violence, but insecure in their masculinity, because this constant framing as like physical fit, posing, half naked, like upper body, showing their muscles, pretending to be super strong, pretending to prepare for this confrontation in the future. Anyone who is secure in their masculinity doesn't need to do this. So in a way, when we report about threats like this, active clubs, for example, there is like a balance that should be we should try to achieve by, for example, in this context, in Tennessee or in Virginia. So this is a neo-Nazi militia dressing up as a sports club. They reach out to gyms. They train in gyms. They reach out to local communities. They present themselves in some kind of support role in political campaigns that happened in Tennessee a few years ago. They try to, that's in their strategy, when there's a violent conflict at a high school, for example, and it has like a racist connotation. Let's say there's violence between white and black kids. They should show up, and they should support the white kids in training and otherwise protection and so on, right? So what we should do, I think, when addressing such a complex and in its core smart and dangerous strategy, is to be using more of a scalpel approach than a sledgehammer, meaning reaching out to gym owners, to local law enforcement, to local mayors, and so on, giving them the information. This group is active in your neighborhood. Maybe you know this already, but do you know the whole story? And then just give them the information so they are not inadvertently collaborating, for example, giving space, facilities to this network unknowingly. Right. So this is, I think, what we can do. We can, of course, report about incidents. We can report about the general threat these groups are posing, but there is a downside in potential over-reporting because they really appreciate any kind of media attention.
You mentioned the commercial gyms, the dojos, that type of thing. Uh, do 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 these groups target local gyms? And if you were a local gym owner, what would your approach be to dealing with these groups?
Well, it would, I guess, depend on my politics, right? So I guess someone could say, I don't care that this is a neo-Nazi group. They follow the rules in my gym. I'm not necessarily a sympathizer. Maybe I am a sympathizer. They follow the rules. They pay the fees. I'll let them train here. But a lot of people will say, I don't want to have a neo-Nazi group that pretends to be a sports club, but actually is training to be a militia in my vicinity. I need to protect the other members. I don't want to be associated with them. But how do I know what active clubs are? And this is why targeted like outreach is, I think, one way to deal with this. So local mayors or local governance authorities that are responsible for, community activities could reach out to the gyms and the dojos if an active club is active in that city or in that neighborhood, and just inform them, give them the information. But also, of course, we shouldn't overreact here, right? Again, this is not about combat sports. This is also not about speech. This is about building a neo-Nazi militia undercover in practicing for targeted violence. So I think targeted, scalpel-like approaches, informing people who need to know the full picture, but not overreacting and basically inadvertently doing some propaganda work for them, would be a good way forward.
What is the danger in allowing these people to work out in your gym?
Recruitment. The main aspect would definitely be recruitment. In their own strategy, they're saying, how about we all show up at the gym, let's say wearing our own merchandise. There's a business aspect to all of this. You can buy all kinds of merchandise that is produced by Active Club affiliates. So let's say there's 3 or 4 people. They are somewhat in shape. They all wear the same outfit. And their idea is then that some men will approach them and ask, what are you guys about? And then they will ask them or offer them to join some of their combat sports training that they do somewhere else. Right. So they would use the dojo, the gym, the whatever it is as a recruiting ground. And secondly, of course, it could be also for target selection, right? So if you are spending a lot of time in such a facility and there are people that you consider as your political enemies, they might attack them at some point. Maybe not in the dojo, but maybe in another context. So I think any owner or operator of a sports facility, for example, should know that these are realistic possibilities here. And therefore, of course, I would recommend not allow for active club members to use these facilities.
Last question. You have a tremendous amount of expertise in this area. As you look into your crystal ball, what is your fear? How do you see this threat being manifested in the near term or the long term?
My biggest concern is that analysts and reporting and government agencies look at the active clubs and think that this is about sports, which is somewhat concerning. Racists and neo-Nazis doing sports together like boxing and MMA. But this is not really the story, and this is not really the threat. A lot of these fighters, or let's say individuals in the active club network, are not great fighters. There is a lot of discussion in the network if this, let's say, a brutal training that they're often doing is actually a good idea, because they might be giving each other brain trauma in the process, right? So this is just to say there's very little evidence that this is a sophisticated combat sports network. So my biggest concern is that we would fall for the propaganda that says, don't look at us. There's nothing to see here. We're just a bunch of white men. We like to hike and do stuff that is around sports, but actually that they are preparing for targeted violence undercover, and that this is not being appreciated and understood by especially law enforcement. This is the biggest threat. This is basically the strategy. The active club strategy will be successful if law enforcement thinks that this is just another right-wing sports club, and it will be stopped and it will fail, the active club strategy, if we understand that they're trying to build a militia and allocate the necessary resources to stop them.
Well, Alexander, I appreciate your time. My fear is that this will not be the last time that we will need to have this conversation with everything that's happening in the world right now. But thank you so much for your expertise and for sharing that with us.
Thank you for the time. I enjoyed it.